Everyone, welcome to FPI's first briefing for fiscal year 2027. This is our response to the State of the State that was given yesterday by Governor Hochul. Also, this recording will be merged into the actual recording from the event. I forgot to press record, so I'm just going to do the first few slides and then it'll transition into the actual event recording. Okay, the agenda for this presentation is that first we will talk about the fiscal outlook of the state, both the state's revenue projections as well as the impact of federal funding cuts. Then we'll talk about threats to New York's healthcare and health insurance. Then we'll talk about the flagship universal childcare plan that is agreed to by the New York City mayor and the governor. Then we'll talk about a few other areas of affordability policy, including housing and food policy. We'll talk about FPI's revenue proposals for funding these essential investments, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. And I just want to point out right now that the next FPI briefing will be January 22nd, which is next Thursday at 12 p.m. And that's when we'll have more details on the governor's proposals, because at that point, we'll actually have the governor's fiscal plan. Okay, so first, the fiscal outlook. So the state's fiscal base remains very strong. Fiscal year 2026, which is this current fiscal year, is on track to have a surplus in excess of $5 billion. That is going to make it possible for the state to continue having its record high $33 billion in fiscal reserves. So this is a very strong fiscal state to be in. Then the state projects, so the division of budget in its revenue projections uses flat nominal growth projections for the economy for revenue through fiscal year 2028. But flat nominal growth, and assuming there's some inflation, implies a recession. It implies sort of negative real growth or a contraction in the state. If we instead use projections that are based on sort of average historical growth rates, we will get, rather than having any fiscal gaps, we would instead have a $2 billion budget surplus in the next fiscal year. And then on top of these like sort of pessimistic growth outlooks, the division of budget prices in or includes planned tax cuts that are policy choices, and we would recommend against these tax cuts. And then also doesn't include in-year fiscal reserves. There's a sort of reserve called the transaction risk reserve, which is $2 billion. If you did include that $2 billion reserve and you don't include the planned tax cuts, and you do project revenue growing at more average rates and not a recession, then we're on track for a $5 billion surplus in next fiscal year. So we see the state's fiscal position as quite strong. Now, the thing that we don't see as strong is that we believe that the division of budget is actually somewhat underestimating the severity of federal funding cuts. The reason that they're underestimating the severity of these cuts from our perspective is that they're not planning for policy that keeps people's benefits and services sustained. So we estimate that the cost of federal funding cuts to New York will total $5.8 billion in fiscal year 2027 and up to $15 billion by fiscal year 2030. So they're going to grow over time. They estimate, the division of budget estimates lower costs because they do not plan for policy that holds essential services constant. And those essential services are mainly Medicaid, the essential plan, and SNAP. In considering revenue options to try to hold the services constant, the state should look to recapture roughly $12 billion that New York's high earners will now not be paying in federal taxes because of the Trump tax cuts. So the high earners in New York are receiving a federal tax benefit from the tax cuts that were passed by the Trump administration this past summer. We propose that the state of New York try to recapture some of those tax savings and put them towards continued services in the state. Okay, and now I'll pass to my colleague, Michael Knukin.
My name is Michael Knuck, and I'm the Health Policy Director at the Fiscal Policy Institute. I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of cuts through HR 1 and also of sort of unregulated private sector healthcare cost growth on the state budget and the state healthcare system. So next slide. Thank you. So as most people listening in probably know, HR 1 included really dramatic cuts to Medicaid, to other healthcare programs that are federally funded. And those cuts will be especially severe here in New York because they are targeted at immigrants and we have a large immigrant population. I'm just going to sort of run through the highlights of those cuts. Work requirements in Medicaid and other changes to Medicaid eligibility are likely going to result in 750,000 New Yorkers losing coverage unless the state takes action to prevent it. I'll flag initial estimates from state DOH were that these cuts could impact 1.2 million New Yorkers. After further analysis, we now think that's high. The impact will be only 750,000, but it's still a huge, huge loss of insurance. There also in HR 1, there are major cuts to the Essential Plan, which covers 1.7 million low-income New Yorkers. Those cuts will amount to reducing Essential Plan funding by just about half, by 7.5 billion annually. And then outside HR 1, as most people probably know, the federal government has allowed enhanced premium tax credits to expire. That is likely to represent a 40% premium increase for the 140,000 or so people in the New York State individual market who receive premium tax credits. So the Essential Plan impacts are sort of the most complex to talk about here. And so I want to spend a minute talking about what the state plans to do to address Essential Plan cuts. So next slide. Thank you. So over the summer, when it first became clear that the federal government was going to gut funding for the Essential Plan, the state announced a plan to move most of the immigrants on the Essential Plan onto state-funded Medicaid. This would have cost the state about $3 billion a year. And people might remember that the director of the budget announced that there would be a $3 billion fiscal gap and so forth. And then under that plan, another 225,000 people with somewhat higher incomes would have just lost coverage entirely. The state has come up with a new and improved plan that somewhat mitigates these harms. So the new plan, which was announced in September, would have Essential Plan eligibility lowered. Right now, Essential Plan is available to people making up to 250% of the federal poverty line. That would go down to 200%. As it was until 2024, and reverting to the sort of pre-2024 status quo will allow the state to access accumulated reserves from the Essential Plan as it was back then to provide full coverage on the Essential Plan for everyone under 200% of the federal poverty line. For the next 2 to 3 years, the math isn't totally clear. And after that, we would need to develop a new source of revenue, right? But so the roughly 1.3 million New Yorkers on the Essential Plan who are under 200% of the federal poverty line will have their health insurance preserved. The flip side is that about 450,000 essential plan enrollees who are currently above 200% of the federal poverty line, between 200% and 250%, will either have to move to the individual market, where they'll pay much more for much worse health insurance, or if they can't afford that, or if they're debarred due to immigration status from that, they'll become uninsured. So that's a huge threat, and it's coming up really fast. Starting in July of 2027, those people lose essential plan coverage. So next slide. So in summary, what we're looking at is 750,000 people lose coverage due to Medicaid work requirements. Those losses will begin in January 2027, so in the last quarter of this fiscal year that we're now debating. On the essential plan, 450,000 people lose coverage even sooner in July 2027. Among those, about 80% will be eligible for premium tax credits in the individual market, but many of those people won't be able to afford it. They'll become uninsured. And another 20%, due to their immigration status, will not, at least in the long term, be eligible for premium tax credits. So they will almost certainly become uninsured. And then in the individual market, we're already seeing a huge premium spike that will cause people to become uninsured. So next slide. So the bottom line here is that these cuts collectively risk doubling the New York State uninsurance rate from 5% now to 10%. We're talking about 1 million New Yorkers losing coverage. The state of the state response on these issues is somewhat disappointing. So there is no plan articulated in the state of the state so far to address Medicaid coverage losses. On the essential plan, there is a vague proposal to sort of negotiate better health care for the 450,000 people who lose essential plan coverage. There are no state dollars invested in that program. In that plan, so it's unclear what the language means, but it is clear that the state isn't putting money behind it. And then for the individual market, there's no state investment to keep people covered. So next slide. Now, the state does not have to accept these insurance losses, these rates of uninsurance, right? So the state already provides healthcare to some people without any federal subsidy. It provides state-only financed Medicaid for certain categories of immigrants. And the state could very well invest some money to maintain coverage. So for instance, for the folks who lose coverage due to work requirements, the state could provide temporary state-funded coverage. So let's say if you lose coverage due to work requirements, you get to stay on state-funded Medicaid for 3 to 6 months while you work to get your paperwork straight and so forth. It could also invest in support to keep people enrolled. That would look like much more funding for DOH to implement these work requirements in the minimally harmful way. It would look like more community outreach. And then the essential plan, we have 450,000 people moving from the essential plan potentially into the individual market. Most of those people will receive substantial federal premium tax credits, but even with those tax credits, they'll end up being required to spend $200 to $250 a month. These are very low income people making less than $40,000 a year. That may not be affordable to them. The state could choose to invest in further lowering those premiums out of state funds. If the state wanted free premiums for that population, it would cost about $1 billion annually. And likewise, for folks who aren't eligible for federal premium tax credits, that's a smaller group, but the state could subsidize their premiums entirely out of funds, which would cost about $1 billion annually. These are among some creative ideas that the state could pursue in order to maintain insurance coverage. Unfortunately, the state has so far not even discussed these approaches. They're not in the state of the state. And so what we're looking at right now is we are headed toward a situation where 10% of New Yorkers lack access to health insurance. Next slide. Lastly, I want to talk about private sector healthcare affordability. Affordability is such a buzzword in Albany right now and across the country, but private sector healthcare affordability is really not discussed very often. And it's disappointing because we have a real problem with healthcare affordability for people who are on employer-sponsored plans and for their employers. The graph you're looking at, the top blue line is how much the family health insurance premium has increased in the past 23 years. Family health insurance premium for an employer now costs $27,000 a year, right? And so it's an enormous amount of money. The bottom line is how much people's incomes have increased. You can see it's far, far less. Incomes are up about 100% in this 25-year period, but healthcare premiums have tripled for family plans. So next slide. This really impacts New York City small businesses. In New York City, individual premium is $15,000 a year. That's up 38% since 2020. It's really unsustainable. Next slide. And unfortunately, the state of the state also does not take robust action on private sector healthcare affordability, which really will sort of continue to impact the New York State uninsurance rate. So the state could step in to regulate prices through measures like the Fair Pricing Act. The governor proposes to negotiate drug prices for Medicaid, but not for the private sector. That's disappointing. We could look at other states like Colorado is pursuing broader-based drug price negotiations that would lower costs for everyone, not just for Medicaid. That kind of creative idea is unfortunately absent. And so what we're looking at in both public insurance and private insurance is a continued sort of cost spiral, affordability crisis, loss of access to insurance. And I think that's it for me. So I'll pass it to my colleague, Andrew, to talk about childcare.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Perry, the Director of Fiscal Research at the Fiscal Policy Institute, and I'm going to talk about childcare, which is a major issue in the state budget this year. Obviously, last week, the governor announced really what's a historic deal that we see as the first real concrete steps towards establishing universal healthcare in New York State. The deal includes about $2 billion in new investments in the childcare system. We expect that care seats for children under the age of 5, the age at which universal kindergarten becomes available. The deal consists of the beginning of funding free childcare for 2-year-olds in New York City and the consolidation of universal pre-kindergarten in the rest of the state with substantial investments for vouchers for all ages. And we're going to talk about each of those elements in detail. So what's the plan for 2-year-olds? 2-year-olds are going to be supported in New York City by a new program that's referred to as Childcare. The state has committed to funding the first 2 years of the phasing in of Childcare. And in this year, the city expects that funding to be $75 million, supporting about 2,000 seats. That will ramp up to 12,000 seats, supported by $425 million in state funding next year. The full program, once it's up and running, should support about 50,000 children in New York City, 50,000 2-year-olds in New York City, and it should cost about $1 billion a year. Notably, the plan only does not include that full freight program funding. It includes just these first 2 years of phase-in. So what's the plan for preschoolers? Preschoolers are already supported by universal pre-kindergarten in about 75% of the state, and the state budget, or the budget deal that was announced by the governor and the mayor, proposes finishing the job and establishing actual universal pre-kindergarten in New York State. That's going to deliver about 40,000 new UPK seats for 4-year-olds in the rest of the state. It will come at a cost of about $470 million per year. Importantly, this will be done by raising per pupil grants to $10,000 or their foundation aid amount, whichever is greater. And that's going to be true even in districts that already have UPK programs. So many districts right now have UPK programs that are inadequately funded. They have to ration seats or only offer part-day seats. So this is going to expand UPK to districts that don't have it. And in many cases, it will be more generous to districts that do have UPK and allow them to really fully fund their programs. The deal also announced $100 million for 3K, which is UPK for 3-year-olds in New York City. New York City already has a 3K program, but there have been concerns about the quality of some of the seats that are being offered, that they are too far from people's home, that people really aren't getting very good seat offerings, unlike the city's pre-K for 4-year-olds, which is considered a much stronger program. So this $100 million for that will really bolster 3K in New York City. So we have 2-year-olds in New York, 2 and 3-year-olds in New York City, and 4-year-olds in the rest of the state. What about everybody else? And the answer is that the plan wants to invest about $1.2 billion in the Childcare Assistance Program. And the Childcare Assistance Program are income-tested vouchers. The state has expanded this program tremendously in the last 3 years. But even with these expansions, there are wait lists in many districts across the state, including New York City, as state funding hasn't really been commensurate with the expanded eligibility that's been enacted recently. And so the $1.2 billion will be to clear the wait lists in New York City and elsewhere in the state, and support the continued growth we're seeing in the program. That's going to bring total CCAP spending to $3 billion. We're going to have to wait until the budget to see what portion of that is federal money, but somewhere between $600 million and $1 billion is potentially federal funding. And we expect this expanded CCAP funding to support about 50,000 additional vouchers for children under the age of 5. So where's this money coming from? Importantly, the governor did not announce any new revenue measures. So we expect that the UPK and 2Care programs are supported just by general fund revenue. They're not supported by new tax revenue, certainly not dedicated tax revenue, as announced by the governor. It's important to note that UPK is a recurring commitment, right? The governor announced that this is going to be a program. This is actually going to be written into the state law that the grant levels are going to change. And so the state's going to be committed to spending that money every year in the future. 2Care is not. The governor was pretty explicit that it's a 2-year funding commitment. So there's a question mark that we're going to be keeping a close eye on as to what comes after that 2-year period. CCAP, or the recent expansions of CCAP, have largely been backed by state funds, although, as I mentioned, it's possible that some of this cost comes from federal funds. In particular, the state has the ability to shift funds from its TANF block grant, which is a federal block grant that supports a broad range of anti-poverty policy, including cash assistance and tax credits. They can shift some of that funding into CCAP, and we're going to be keeping an eye on exactly what the funding detail is there. So in thinking about how we can assess this deal, we looked back to the 2014 expansion of universal pre-kindergarten in New York City. The conditions are somewhat similar. We had a new mayor who ran explicitly on expanding the early childhood education system and went to Albany with some pretty ambitious demands. So we decided to look back and see what we can learn from that experience. In 2014, the state did enact a UPK program for New York City. New York City already had a fairly limited UPK system that was available only in very high needs districts, and the city wanted to make this truly universal across all districts in the city. And so after pretty intensive negotiations, the state guaranteed New York City $300 million per year. That brought the city's total grants for UPK from the state up to $550 million. Importantly, these grants were baked into state law, meaning that the state actually had to adopt changes to its education law that established this new $300 million grant for the city and guaranteed that that grant would be provided every year, not as a year-to-year appropriation that would be subject to budget debates every year, which appears to be how 2K will be litigated at least in the next 2 years. So we think one of the major lessons for 2Care is that we should have a strong preference for having it as a grant that's actually established by state law that guarantees that we know that the funding will be delivered, will be annual and not subject to annual appropriations fights, that it's a program just like education funding is a program, right? That's guaranteed by, where grants are guaranteed by law every single year. However, the state's UP grant was a fixed flat amount. So that $550 million that New York City secured for itself in 2014 hasn't changed over the last decade. The city still only gets $550 million for universal pre-kindergarten every year from the state. Obviously, program costs have grown substantially, and those program costs have all been contributed by city funds. So an important lesson there is that grants should really be tied to program costs. This is how the school aid formula works. The school aid formula is an automatic formula that's tied to the cost of providing care, and the state is obligated to contribute that funding every year. And so we think those are the important lessons, and we're going to be really looking for those features as budget negotiations unfold.
Okay, so now I'm going to briefly talk about some other types of policy that are included in the State of the State address yesterday, and we'll be looking at the executive budget to see sort of how substantial they are. Starting with food security. So I don't think I talked so explicitly about this before, but the Medicaid and SNAP were the two major areas of federal cuts, as most of you know. And the thing that's going to happen first with SNAP is an increase in how restrictive the work requirements are. And we estimate that about 350,000 New Yorkers might lose SNAP benefits soon under these more restrictive work requirements. The State of the State does have a section on improving food security, but we assess that policy to be relatively weak. It definitely falls short of maintaining full service levels. There's an unclear amount allocated towards improving capital and operating funds for food banks. It's not clear how much money that is at this time. There's a proposal to improve the technology of the SNAP EBT cards in the state to reduce SNAP theft. That's definitely a very good idea, but doesn't do anything to really address sort of the federal cuts that are coming in. And then there's some nod towards helping expand summer meal programs to maximally reach children in the state. Again, that's a great policy. It's more about maximizing federal dollars than it is putting any state dollars towards like a supplement to SNAP. At FPI, we propose that the state implement a state-funded SNAP supplement to help keep benefits coming to people who are now liable to lose their benefits under the federal cuts. And one thing that could be cost effective for the state to do is to increase funding to improve administration of SNAP to help people like make sure they meet the work requirements, or if they have a disability that makes them exempt from the work requirement, make sure that they do their paperwork correctly to remain continue to remain enrolled in the program. Housing policy, there's sort of a slew of housing policy in the State of the State. One thing that has been very sort of topical and newsy in New York City is that there is going to be an update to the J51 tax abatement program, which will help improve the accessibility of J51 tax abatements for rent stabilized buildings, because there's been a big debate about the quality of the housing and whether or not rent stabilized buildings are, financially able to sort of maintain themselves. This will be looking to see if this is helpful. There's an additional $250 million to be put into capital investments for new affordable housing around the state. There's a new revolving loan fund to be with an unknown amount of money in it that will be for improving infrastructure for manufactured home parks around the state. There's a big capital investment in water infrastructure, $3.75 billion over 5 years. There's a major income limit increase for the SCREE and DREE programs, which are basically rent freezes for disabled and older adults living in rental units in the city. So, but that income limit has been fixed since 2014. So that income limit will be increased so that more people are eligible for SCREE and DREE. There's going to be a small increase in the amount of money being put towards home climatization programs to try to improve the energy efficiency of homes around the state. And there's some vague first steps being put towards decreasing home insurance costs in the state. There's notably not a funding plan for NYCHA, which is in need of major capital and operating investments. And there's no additional funds in the state of the state for the Housing Access Voucher Program. I guess that's all I have on housing. So I'm just going to move us into the FPI revenue agenda. So you've heard us all talk about, I think in particular, childcare and healthcare, and then to some extent, food security and housing, which are all in need of more funding to really keep services the same or improve services in the case of childcare. So FPI's tax agenda starts with a proposal to recapture federal tax cuts. As I mentioned earlier, New York's millionaire earners are going to have roughly $12 billion in federal tax savings coming from the Trump tax cuts that occurred earlier this year, or I guess in 2025. So we propose that the state sort of try to recapture some of those savings and put them towards services in the state. Since we estimate that in total, Medicaid and SNAP programs will see cuts in New York that are about $6 billion this year and will increase over time to close to $15 billion in 2030. We are going to need to raise revenue to sort of keep those services the same. We can keep those services the same by recapturing some of the tax cuts that high earners received. A second prong of the tax agenda is funding the universal childcare program. So as Andrew mentioned, there's currently no new revenue going into the childcare proposal that the mayor of New York City and the governor agreed upon. But that is not going to be sustainable. We will need new revenue to actually keep the program going beyond 2 years. FPI estimates that the New York City cost is $3.5 billion and the statewide cost is $8 billion. And we propose a tax program that combines progressive income taxes with broad-based payroll taxes, similar to how the MTA is funded. So one model that we've put forward and that you can read about in a brief that we released a couple of weeks ago is a combination of income taxes on the top 1% or on millionaire earners that would raise $1.5 billion, a corporate surtax that would raise $2.2 billion, and a payroll tax on wages that would raise another $3.6 billion. Oh, and investment income tax that's like on capital gains that would raise another $700 million. So by combining these sort of progressive taxes and the broad-based payroll tax, we could fund a truly universal, fully launched program. Just a couple notes on technical options for more revenue in the state. At the federal level, the federal tax on multinational corporations does tax corporations that move their profits to tax havens. It used to be called GILTI. Now it's called the NCTI, and I forget what that stands for, to be honest. But basically, New York does not include this in the corporate tax, but could include it in the corporate tax. And we would estimate that the state would gain $1 to $1.5 billion in revenue if we did capture those sort of profits that are in tax havens at the moment. one more technical option is the pass-through entity tax. So as part of the 2017 tax cuts, there was a limit on the state and local tax deduction of $10,000 put in place. So high earners like effectively saw their taxes increase. But then New York created this trick that allows owners of businesses or some businesses to basically like file business taxes and then get credit on their income taxes. And that's called the pass-through entity tax. So that kind of is a loophole essentially that was created so that people, high earners, could get around this Trump tax change that limited the state and local tax deduction. But we give them 100% income tax credit. We could lower that 100% to some other high percent. Other states do this, and that would allow the state to raise roughly $1.5 billion annually. So that's another sort of technical thing that would raise a significant amount of revenue in the state. Okay, that's it for us on content. Now we're going to have a bunch of time for questions and answers. We can definitely go for at least 20 minutes or more, depending on how many questions you have. I just want to point out that on the screen right now are QR codes for our next briefing, which will be sort of our first assessment of the executive budget next Thursday. And with that, I'll let you ask questions.
Any in the room?
Yeah.
I have a bunch.
Go for it.
Could you, first of all, could you speak to why you're
So the question in the room is why FPI's tax plan includes a payroll tax option rather than a progressive income tax. And the answer is that we do include a progressive tax on raising the rate on incomes above $1 million. And we pair that with the existing payroll tax. Now, it's important to note that the state already has a payroll tax that pays for paid family leave, and it's paid by the employee, comes out of people's paychecks. That tax is capped at the state average income, which is about $95,000. So you don't pay any tax on income that's earned above that level. So if you make $200,000, you only pay the tax on the first $95,000 of your income. Our proposal is to remove that tax, or to remove that tax cap, and not to raise the rate. The rate would really be about the same as what it is today, but there would be no cap. So even though it looks like this sort of broad-based thing, it's actually quite progressive in effect. It means that everybody has the same average rate, right? So right now, if you earned $1 million a year, your effective payroll tax rate under the existing PFL payroll tax is about 1/10 of what it is for somebody who earns $50,000. And we would just make that rate neutral for people of all incomes. And we think that would and because the rate, the base of that tax is all the income that's earned in New York State, it's quite a broad base. So we think that broad base, even at a very low rate, is sufficient to really drive the kind of revenue that we need for a program like universal childcare. Yeah, I have a question here. Does our estimate of $8 billion for statewide universal childcare include the New York City costs? And the answer is that yes, it does. Our statewide cost estimate is the entire state, including the city. The city is a bit less than half of the state cost because we factor in the money that the state and local governments already spend on childcare. And New York City already spends about $1.2 billion of its own money providing childcare to 3- and 4-year-olds. So we factor that in, but that's included in the overall cost. Let's see here. We have another question. Am I from the chat? Am I correct that the governor has not proposed broad-based tax increases? That's right. The governor has not proposed any tax increases in her state of the state. We're going to keep a lookout for the executive budget, whether it extends the corporate tax rate. Right now, the corporate tax rate is set for a tax cut. It's possible that will be extended, although the governor hasn't indicated one way or the other. So we're going to keep an eye out for that. The second question there is this the surplus of $5 billion? Our $5 billion sort of adjusted surplus factors in really three things. One is we assume normal revenue growth rather than no revenue growth, which we think is unrealistic given the economic outlook. Two, we factor in that planned corporate tax rate that I just mentioned. Right now, the corporate tax is set for a cut. We're assuming that it's extended at least its current rate. And three, we factor in those in-year reserves that we mentioned. Right now, the state sets aside $2 billion for every single year. It doesn't use the money and it gets returned to the general fund. So we're factoring that in. And that's where our $5 billion surplus estimate comes from.
There's a second part of that question that's about like the offsetting OBBA cuts.
Yeah, the $5 billion surplus really doesn't speak to the OBBA cuts. It's just assuming sort of normal fiscal management from the state and not letting the corporate tax rate expire. So those would be $5 billion of additional resources that the state could use to respond to the OBBA cuts. Sure. We have another question. Does your estimate for childcare include competitive compensation for the childcare workforce? The answer is that it does. Our cost estimates factor in a living wage for both the city and for the rest of state.
So obviously, providing healthcare to folks.
Yeah, I love that question. We have a question from the in-person audience. What is the cost of allowing a bunch of people to lose health insurance and sort of not covering them? Will it cause the state to lose money in other ways if people get sick, can't work, and so forth? The answer is yes. And what I would say especially is the people who lose health insurance don't stop using healthcare, especially if they have a serious medical condition, which is where most healthcare costs actually come from, right? It's not your annual checkup that's costing money. It's chemotherapy, it's ICU care if you get hit by a car and so forth. Folks who need that kind of care will still show up in hospital emergency rooms, and ultimately the state will be on the hook for supporting hospitals that do provide that kind of care. And so we have a forthcoming paper that tries to estimate that out and sort of net out how much the state would have to spend to keep people insured versus how much it would save by avoiding throwing its hospitals into crisis and so forth. So great question.
I can take this question on, does the state make a return on its $33 billion in reserves? The answer is yes, it does. It earns at sort of the neutral rate of money. If you kept your money if you're in a money market fund, that's about what the state gets in return on its general fund balances. I think it's projecting that rates will come down a little bit and something like $2 billion in revenue out of that.
Sorry, we have a question from in the room about the cancellation of the MCO tax and what impact that will have. So the MCO tax was a mechanism New York State was using for the past year to essentially increase federal Medicaid funding by taxing New York State MCOs and then spending that money back with the Medicaid tax. it was generating about $1.6 billion a year. The HR1 eliminated that extra federal funding, and so the state is losing $1.6 billion a year of MCO tax revenue. That money was spent in a bunch of different ways, in part to just sort of generally pay for Medicaid, in part to fund rate increases for hospitals and other healthcare providers, and in part for the safety net, to fund the safety net transformation program, which is a state program that supports safety net hospitals. That funding is lapsing in March, and so there will be questions about how we can sort of replace that, the programs that were funded by that revenue. I think a major issue in this budget cycle in particular is whether we're gonna find other state money to sustain the hospital rate increases that were funded by that revenue. That is unaddressed in the state of the state, so we'll have to wait and see. There is mention of investing a bit more in the safety net transformation program. And there's a question about hospital closures and hospital jobs. This whole complex of things, right? Like the cuts to safety net funding, the loss of insurance and so forth, is likely to drive a bunch of safety net hospitals close to the wall financially. The state will need to invest more sort of grant funding in keeping hospitals open or accept significant hospital closures and job losses. We're really concerned about that. And we had a paper this summer suggesting that as many as 70 hospitals across New York State could be in real financial trouble and potentially at risk of closure if the state doesn't sort of invest more funding to support them.
The question is whether the increase in UPK grants coming from the state will apply to the city because the city already has a UPK program. And the answer is that it absolutely should. And given the sort of top line spending estimate floated by the governor, we believe it does. Because the city right now gets a relatively small amount of per pupil funding from the state as those sort of, I mentioned in the past that it's fixed at a 2014 amount. So relatively low level of spending. We should get bumped up to that minimum $10,000, which should deliver something like $90 million per year to the city.
Andrew, do you know if there's children with disabilities or have any special entitlement in the childcare plan?
I'll answer. Mute. I don't believe, this is something we can keep an eye out for in the budget legislation. I don't believe there was any special provision other than what's sort of normally in the childcare assistance program provisions for people with disabilities. But that's a good question. It's something we can keep an eye out for once we get sort of details of how these programs are expected to work. Is $1.2 billion for CCAP going to be enough to clear the wait list across the state? Or is it only enough for New York City? We expect that it's for the whole state, not just the city. The city has requested more than $1.2 billion. They requested $1.8 billion just for the city to really not clear the wait list. The wait list is only about 10,000 people, so the $1.2 billion should be more than enough to clear the wait list. The city has pretty aggressive growth assumptions for the next year and a half. It makes projections 18 months in advance, and they think caseloads are going to grow substantially over that 18-month future 18-month period, and that's why they requested $1.8 billion. So we think there's probably still a question mark about whether the city's share of the $1.2 billion will be enough. It's important to note that if it's paired with expansions to 2K and 3K, that will be sort of subtractive from the overall amount of care that we need. We're going to provide children with care through other channels. So, whether it's enough to support the growth is a question that we all have to keep an eye on. Is it enough to clear the wait list? Absolutely. 10,000 kids on the wait list should be more than covered by this funding.
There's another childcare question.
Can you repeat the total amount
Childcare fund.
of Childcare funding? Yes, the governor committed to funding $75 million this fiscal year 2027, rising to $425 million next year, fiscal year 2028.
And how many?
We think that's 2,000 spots this year, rising to 12,000 spots next year. Our estimate of the full freight cost is $1 billion. So I think that question says that they thought the 2-year cost was $2 billion. That would be the full freight cost once the program is totally up and running. The governor's announcement did not commit to that level. That would, yeah.
Nancy Romer asks in the chat about efforts to enact the New York Health Act. The New York Health Act would enact a state-level single-payer program in New York. And there is obviously an active campaign that's been going on for many years to advance that policy. We're supportive of that kind of transformative change in healthcare. What I would just emphasize is that we in New York have a really robust system of public insurance that we can be really proud of. 54% of New Yorkers currently rely on public health insurance, be that Medicare, Medicaid, or the Essential Plan. In the immediate term, with state revenue, we can afford to protect and even expand that system. And we know that providing public health insurance keeps people healthy. It's fiscally responsible for the state. It's much more cost effective on a dollar for dollar basis than private sector healthcare, especially for low income workers, right? And so, I think in thinking about how to step forward towards a much better system, we also need to sort of protect against moving backward into where we were before the Affordable Care Act with 10% of New Yorkers uninsured, and think in terms of the steps we can take to protect and expand the existing public healthcare infrastructure.
I'm just going to answer a couple of questions on taxes. I see, I believe Nancy Romer also, you asked about the present campaign to end the state tax cuts. I think what you're asking about is what Andrew had mentioned, which is that there's a corporate tax cut that basically there was a corporate tax increase that's sunsetting this year. So, there are the Invest in Our New York campaign, there are campaigns that are about state revenue. I don't know of a campaign specifically about those tax cuts, though. Do you know of anything? No.
No.
No. So yeah, we do believe that that is something that people should be paying attention to and advocating for, because it's a source of revenue that the state will lose in the next year. Let's see, we answered the New York Health Act. Just want to say out loud, yes, we'll provide a video and the slides online and send those around soon. Also, while I'm talking about logistics, these QR codes are here for your convenience so that you can talk to us next week also when we have more details about the governor's proposals. Oh, and there's a question about this New York stock transfer tax. Any thoughts on reviving New York stock transfer tax? That has not been an FPI policy proposal, largely because we're focused on broad-based revenue generators. So that's why we've been focused on and already existing sort of mechanisms. So the personal income tax, payroll tax, and corporate surcharges, surtaxes. I think that's all the questions that we have so far on the chat. Any more in the room? You can definitely keep asking. Yeah.
Yeah. So back to universal childcare. The $8 billion was the total for the state or outside New York City?
8 billion is for the total of the state, including New York City.
Okay. And that's like a lot less than like New Yorkers United for childcare's estimate. Is there, I mean, and I've seen estimates as high as 20.
Well, yeah, New Yorkers United is only a bit above us. Our estimates for something like Childcare and statewide universal pre-kindergarten are very similar, and so we just kind of extend that methodology going down. It's important to note that we factor in money that we're already spending. So New York City especially spends some of its own money on 3K and 4K, and we're factoring in the substantial investments that the state has made in recent years on CCAP. We have a methodology for estimating how much we're spending on CCAP each year. So some of the differences are accounted for by that, but we use broadly the same methodology.
We're going to wrap up. Thank you all for your questions and for coming. I hope to see you at our briefing next Thursday when we'll have more details on the governor's proposals because we'll have the financial plan. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you.